Thank you, Jonathan, for such a nice introduction. I've never spoken to a virtuous audience before, so I'm not used to this experience. Okay, so as Jonathan said, today I want to talk about what I call the tragedy of public trust in science. I always call it the tragedy in 4 acts. What's going to happen is the first 3 acts are going to be very familiar, little moves in philosophical debate, a few kind of changes of emphasis to some standard debates. Now I would suggest if we kind of add all those together, we realise that the situation which faces the relationship between publics and scientists is importantly analogous to the situation which faces Romeo and Juliet. But we'll get there. We'll get there. I promise the slightly mysterious title will make sense later on. Okay, to give you a way into the talk, however, I want to start with 2 examples. So I've been interested for very many years in vaccine skepticism. There's a key case where people often talk about a lack of public trust in science. And I just want you to consider 2 kinds of vaccine skeptic. And now, change. Oh. Okay. So first kind of skeptic, this is one we call Carrie Madej, who was very popular on YouTube during the pandemic. And here's what Madej says in her videos with regard to the COVID-19 vaccine. She said, the scientists are not following any sound scientific protocol to make sure this vaccine is safe. Instead, they are intending to make us into genetically modified organisms. Now, very often when we talk about vaccine skepticism, we talk about this phenomenon of so-called misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and so on. People like Madej are at the front of our minds. Yeah, people who are kind of pushing straightforwardly false or straightforwardly false claims. I was going to get involved in philosophical nuance. Okay, this is just kind of just not true. However, when you look at lots of sociological and anthropological research on vaccine hesitancy and vaccine skepticism, one thing you'll find is often a much more complicated story. So here's a lovely quote from research done by the anthropologist Melissa Leach. So Leach and Fairhead have this really nice book where they compare polio vaccine hesitancy in West Africa and MMR vaccine hesitancy in the UK. This is an interview from a young mother in Brighton towards the height of towards the height of the worries about the MMR vaccine in the late 1990s, early 2000s. She says, if I drop a ring on the floor and I see it rolling in one direction, and I tell you it is in the other direction, you won't see it. They are not looking in the right place, so they won't find it. They are not looking at our children. What's going on in this quote? Well, the most organised resistance to the MMR vaccine was based on the claim that the vaccine was dangerous only for children who already had a genetic predisposition to develop autism. So most people who are members of anti-vaccination campaign groups typically came from families where there was an elder child who already had autistic symptoms. These parents produced their own reports. In these reports, they claimed that what was happening was the kind of population-level studies of MMR safety were not focused on families which had a family history of autism. So the cases where the vaccine was causing autism were not being picked up in the data because the data wasn't focusing in on these families. Here's all I want to say for now. We have 2 cases of vaccine hesitancy. Okay, so WHO defines vaccine hesitance as people who refuse vaccination despite being aware of the scientific consensus the vaccine is safe and effective. Okay, in some sense, both Carrie Madej and this young mum know there is a scientific consensus. Madej, however, just denies the scientific consensus can be trusted because she makes the scientists are in cahoots to genetically modify us all. This mother, by contrast, believes the scientific consensus, in some sense, is fine. The scientists have done the stats properly, as it were. They just aren't looking in the right place. What I want to get to in this talk, ultimately, is a way of understanding, in the first few parts of this talk, basically sections 1 to 3, I want to kind of just give you a framework for understanding these two kinds of mistrust. Okay? I'm going to call one of them something like epistemic or expert trust, and the other one I'm going to call advisory trust. I'm just going to try to spell out this picture. Then what I want to do in the final part is suggest that if you take this kind of story, most of which I hope would be fairly obvious. Yeah, I hope for most of us talking, thinking, well, you know, why is he saying this? Actually, we get this kind of tragic setup in understanding the relationship between scientists and publics. Just to set the background, because I know, so when I've given this talk before, people will often say, isn't this a bit like so-and-so's account? Isn't this a bit like so-and-so's account? I'm just going to give you two recent discussions of public trust in science in the literature. And I'm going to point to some ways in which I think those accounts, while very helpful, may be missing something as a way of kind of easing into the philosophical distinctions I want to give you. So here's some recent work on public trust in science. The first comes from this really nice work by Matthew Bennett. Bennett, writing in the context of a pandemic initially, is interested in this slogan, this infamous slogan that the government is following the science. And he says there's talk of a crisis of trust in science, and all Bennett does is, in some, I say all, you know, it's just one of those nice points where a simple philosophical distinction helps a lot. Bennett says, look, there is a distinction between epistemic trust, believing something on the basis of someone else's say-so, in Bennett's distinction, you know, we can fiddle around, and recommendation trust, which is believing I should do something because the person I recommendation trust has told me I should. Yeah? So maybe I might have epistemic trust in the priest. You know, the priest tells me this is the way to Tesco. I believe this is the way to Tesco. On the other hand, I might lack recommendation trust in the priest. When the priest says I should go to church and pray to relieve my sins, I don't follow his recommendation. All Bennett wants to say is that very often when we talk of a public crisis of trust in science, we often confuse these two. So we'll often note something like people do not vaccinate their children, and we'll say people do not trust the science, and all Bennett wants to say is, well, look, it's entirely possible they have epistemic trust in a scientist, they just don't agree with a normative recommendation which is being offered. So we might believe the vaccine is safe, but for some reason still not vaccinate their children. Let's say they've got a religious objection to the use of vaccines. In some sense, I think what Bennett is saying here is really obvious. I mean, you know, it just follows from standard philosophical claims that there must be a distinction between various kinds of factual testimony and various kinds of normative testimony. And just because I'm willing to place epistemic trust in someone, I may not necessarily be willing to trust their normative recommendations. On the other hand, there's something slightly tricky about Bennett's distinction. One issue is he ties recommendation trust very much to a speech act of recommending. You know, he says recommendations are when we explicitly say you should do Y. But of course, there seem to be all sorts of cases where we recommend or advise or do something like give normative advice without explicitly engaging in recommendation speech acts. It's a very nice paper by Hapgood Coote where he talks about how asking a question can be a form of giving advice. Yeah? So you say, what should I do? I think, well, what would you do if you were advising someone else in this situation? And somehow the very asking of a question constitutes a useful bit of advice. Bennett, of course, can have ways around this. Yeah, I mean, just has to say the kind of surface grammar of a recommendation may not be the guide to its a recommendation. But here's a deeper worry, which Bennett himself discusses but doesn't ever really resolve in his paper. Underlying this distinction, there looks to be a strong kind of distinction between the is and the ought. But there's also been a huge pile of work in recent philosophy of science arguing that science is in some sense value-laden. Now we're going to come back to what that means later in this talk. But if you think there is some sense in which when scientists are engaging in their scientific work, they are making some kind of implicit value judgments, at least at some points, and it looks like the distinction between epistemic and recommendation trust might be shakier than Bennett allows. Second theory in the literature very much starts from a concern about that notion that science is value-laden. This comes from work by Urzig and Thomas, where they distinguish what they call basic and enhanced trust in a scientific speaker. So M has basic trust in S, where M takes the fact that S believes and has communicated with P to be a strong but a feasible reason to believe with P. This is just a version, in effect, of Emmett's epistemic trust. Yeah? However, what they're worried about is various accounts of the literature which suggest that when scientists come to decide to assert some claim, then scientists run inductive risks, they balance the risks of the false positive against the risks of the false negative, and there seems to be a danger, they're worried, that the ways in which scientists themselves balance a false positive, false negative risk in coming to decide to speak may not be the way in which the audience themselves believes those risks should be balanced. So they suggest that there's also a second phenomenon, which they call enhanced trust. Enhanced trust is basic trust plus this condition in making methodological decisions regarding the distribution of inductive risks with respect to P. S makes those decisions in agreement with M's assessment of the inductive risks in question. Think about it this way, we'll come back to this example later. The scientist says something like the vaccine is safe. When the scientist says that there is a danger, but they will say the vaccine is safe when in fact it isn't safe, they'll have set an inductive risk trade-off. Thomas's worry is that in some sense I might suspect that the inductive risk trade-off the scientist has set is not well aligned to how I believe that should be set. Yeah? So I might think, well, you know, you've said it, but in some sense, is that certain enough for me to accept it? That's their basic worry. This obviously gets around some of the issues in Bennett's account, but two things going on here. One is and Thomas are incredibly vague on what exactly the difference is between having basic trust and enhanced trust in someone. They talk about it in terms of believing and being more willing to believe. Being disposed to believe and being very disposed to believe or something. I mean, what exactly marks the difference in terms of the audience's attitude? Second, note as I said that enhanced trust involves basic trust plus the extra condition. Now this is going to become very important later, but it's not at all clear that this is going to really help us because it looks as if basic trust is something like trust in the speaker to follow the norms or rules of some community and therefore to communicate P according to the norms of that community. Enhanced trust may seem to link to notions of discretion, and then you might worry that the norms of the community can be systematically wrong from the audience's perspective. I'll come back to that later. So here's what I want to say. In the literature on how publics come to trust experts, there's a lot of focus on this kind of problem. This is a version of what Goldman calls a novice to expert problem. So imagine I'm a novice, I've never been to Paris, I want to find an expert guide to Paris. Yeah? And I've got two options for my expert guide. One is the guidebook to Paris, and one is, again, Harry Madej, who we'll assume has branched out from anti-vax YouTube videos to do like travel guides to Paris. Okay? Goldman's problem is, as a non-expert in Paris, maybe the rough guide says, I don't know, there's a big Arc de Triomphe, and Harry Madej says, genetically modified organisms everywhere. As someone who's never been to Paris, I don't know, I can't assess the first order claims, so I need second order indicators of expertise. And in this case, presumably I'm going to say, well, the person who wrote this book has lived in Paris for many years, blah, 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 blah. Yeah? That's a very familiar setup in discussions of epistemology of testimony. How, when the novice is confronted by two putative experts, how does a novice decide which of the two putative experts is the true expert? However, I think very often in our social epistemic life, that's not the problem we face. The problem we face is a problem far more like this. We have claims from two experts, both of whom plausibly are true experts. Yeah? I'm very willing to concede that the person who wrote this guidebook and the person who wrote this guidebook are both equally well qualified experts on the facts about Paris. How do we make this kind of choice? Well, here's some very obvious things I might do. Imagine I'm in the bookshop. I wanted to know. I'm still old enough to buy guidebooks when I go on holiday. So I find this example very intuitive. But I feel I'm displaying my age. Maybe I flick through. I notice, this place focuses on, let's say, haute cuisine restaurants. This place has a special section on fusion food or something. And I'm like, I know what, I really like all that haute cuisine stuff. I'm going to buy this guidebook instead. Now when I choose a second guidebook, in some sense it's analogous. It looks from the outside the same as choosing to buy a guidebook as opposed to relying on carrying that. But of course, in choosing this guidebook over this guidebook, I'm not judging that the author of this guidebook is a true expert in a way in which the author of this guidebook is not. All I'm doing is I'm deciding this expert is better aligned to my interests, my idiosyncratic interests. All I want to do is to spell out this notion. To do that, a few building blocks. We'll start with a very vague notion, following the kind of stuff someone like Edward Craig says in Knowledge of a State of Nature, someone like a researcher informant. The researcher informant is just going to be our deliberately neutral term for someone who finds out about some aspect of the world and communicates her findings to some audience. I'm also going to just assume that there are basic norms which all researcher informants must meet. Various kinds of basic epistemic norms. They should apportion their belief to the evidence. They shouldn't engage in wishful thinking. Various kinds of communicative norms. They shouldn't mislead their audience and so on. Precisely what these norms are is, of course, up for grabs. What I want to assume is there are some basic norms of finding out about the world and communicating on it. Then all I want to note is that those basic norms underdetermine some choices in the process of research and communication. In the sense they render more than one option permissible. Yes? So, just think about the very simple case of researching a guidebook to Paris. The basic norm, to apportion one's belief to the evidence, doesn't tell me which restaurants to research in the first place. The basic norm, do not deceive, doesn't tell me to list restaurant A and not restaurant B. There's some sense in which norms are empty. And in some sense, I make a choice. Note, the choices can be settled by more specific ethical considerations or not. If I've signed a contract, where the contract says my guidebook will focus on haute cuisine, then a more specific norm takes hold. Also, the choices may not be experienced as a choice at all. What I mean is, they are choices from a viewpoint of reconstructing the process of research and informing. So, looking from the outside, as it were, might say, there is no basic epistemic norm saying go to restaurant A, not restaurant B. For a researcher, they may not make a choice at all. It may just be obvious what to do. What's going on here are as-if choices. Points in the process of research and communication where a researcher communicator could have acted differently without violating basic epistemic or communicative norms. And then, using that concept, we can just talk about alignment. So a researcher, investigator is aligned with an audience when making an undetermined choice. She chooses the option which some audience member would, given her non-epistemic values, want her to choose. If the researcher, investigator makes a different choice, she is misaligned. All I'm saying here is just a fancy way of saying, if the guy who wrote this guidebook chooses the kind of restaurants I would want him to report on, he's well aligned. If he doesn't, he isn't. That's it. Note that when people talk about this kind of alignment between speaker and audience, we often assume it requires some kind of sensitivity on behalf of the speaker to the audience. Nothing in this picture demands any kind of sensitivity. Yeah? Why this person focused on haute cuisine restaurants or fusion restaurants? I don't care. It's not that they need a deep knowledge of me. It just needs to be, as a matter of fact, they are aligned. That's a very basic account of writing guidebooks. Here's a puzzle. Like I said, in lots of recent literature, people say that science is, in some sense, is or must be value-laden. Those claims are deeply mysterious. They're deeply mysterious for the obvious fact that scientists do not sit around all the time deciding which values to put into their research. Yeah, it's not as if scientists are in the lab, and then one day they say, hey, what do we do now? Let's put some values in. Or if the scientists are doing that, they hide it very well. It's like a massive conspiracy. So what is going on when people say this? I just take it that all people mean is that scientific practice is full of as-if choice points. Are obvious as-if choice points. Basic norms underdetermine if you're going to research colon cancer or breast cancer. In some sense, we can see the choice to research colon cancer as if it reflected the value judgment. There are communicative choices about reporting the results of your research. In many cases, a choice to report or a choice not to report will both be compatible with basic norms against deceit. And when people say science is deeply value-laden, when people like Heather Douglas say scientists must make inductive risk decisions, or my colleague Anna Alexandrova says scientists must make decisions about how to operationalize concepts, I don't think, again, we should see this as cases where scientists explicitly, consciously make some choice. Instead, we should just see them as ways of saying that there are various aspects of scientific process which might, as a matter of fact, be highly routinized, using particular p-value in statistical testing, using a particular way of measuring GNP or something, where those ways of measuring or those ways of balancing risks are not uniquely determined by basic epistemic and communicative norms. So, in this sense, science is as if value-laden, in the sense that it is as if scientists make explicit evaluative choices. Is that a problem to the epistemic integrity of science? No. Because these choices, by definition, are inside the remit of basic epistemic communicative norms. It is a problem for audiences. Why? Because if a scientist's as-if choice doesn't reflect the way in which the audience would themselves have wanted them to have chosen, then there is a misalignment. Misalignments can be practically costly if we don't spot them. So if I don't realize that the way in which economists have operationalized the notion of well-being, then I may, as it were, invest resources somewhere which, given my values, I don't want to invest. They can also be ethically costly. If I, in some sense, feel it's very important to have a very high it's very important to have a very kind of low, it's very important in my context to have very high standards before accepting a claim. And the scientists have slightly lower standards, but I may in some ways act against what I think is ethically best. And of course, I think all of these kinds of misalignments can be intertwined in complex ways. Yeah? So I won't go into this in any detail because I talked about this recently at the LSE. But I think, for example, many people worry that in the case of evidence-based medicine and evidence-based policy in general, they worry it isn't giving policymakers the information which policymakers need. The way to view this, I think, is that you have a practice of evidence-based medicine. You have a set of epistemic norms which tell practitioners of evidence-based medicine to focus on a particular kind of problem, which can be resolved using a particular kind of tool. And then you have this a set of interlocking practices which lead to this misalignment with the audience. It's not obviously that the evidence-based medicine people are doing anything epistemically problematic. Instead, what they're doing is something which just isn't well aligned to the audience's needs. So given all that, we can define two concepts. A true expert is a researcher informant who, when faced with determined research choices, responds in accordance with the norms of a particular epistemic community, where, over time, adherence to those norms tends to produce high-quality epistemic products, and who meets those norms well. So, a good advisor is a researcher informant who, when faced with undetermined choices in a process of research and communication, responds in ways which reflect how the relevant audience would have wanted them to respond, given her idiosyncratic practical interests. Those are my two concepts from now on. An expert is a researcher informant who, as it were, is in a community where there are a set of conventions for responding to undetermined choices. And precisely because there are conventions, those conventions allow for communication in the community, which allow over time for the generation of knowledge. You might say, well, you said those conventions were arbitrary from a kind of basic standpoint. That doesn't matter. Yeah? It's a mere fact there are conventions, not what the specific convention is, which allows the expert to generate knowledge as part of the community. By contrast, the advisor is someone who is in some sense well aligned to the audience. Note, I'm not saying that advisors aren't experts. I'm not saying experts aren't advisors, at least at this point. Just as the two concepts are different. Yeah? I could think of someone who's in the guild of travel book writers is an expert. but not a good advisor for me. Before I go on, just three things. There's a part of ethical issues around this notion of alignment. Yeah, because you might think, well, surely if people are saying stuff to people, they should be aligned to what they... Blah, blah, blah. Forget that. Okay, just forget it. And the reason I think we should forget it is because most speakers, most of the time, have multiple audiences, such that it's just not at all clear. You know, by aligning to audience 1, I don't align to audience 2. The ethics of alignment, I think, is very complicated. I can put it to one side. Issue 2, you might think this distinction between experts and advisors is a bit like this distinction Croce has between two kinds of expert, what he calls a research-oriented notion of expert and a teaching-oriented conception of an expert, where someone can be a good researcher and not a good teacher, or a good teacher and not a good researcher. That's not my distinction, okay? Because, I mean, I could be an expert who is bad at explaining my research to novices, or an expert who's good at explaining my research to novices. But to the extent my research just doesn't matter, I'm not an advisor. So there's a relationship, is what I'm saying. Finally, some people may know this big debate between Grundmann and Lackey on what they call, very confusingly, authority versus advisory conceptions of expertise. If anyone wants to talk about this later, I can. But it's not the same distinction. We'll come back to that. Why did I go through all this background? Let's go back to our case of vaccine hesitancy. Delay in acceptance or refusal of safe vaccines despite availability of vaccination services. On a standard framing of vaccine hesitancy, we have very true epistemic experts, the virologists who make some claim that vaccines are safe and effective, but non-experts fail to believe their claims. And this situation requires explanation. And in the literature we see various strands of explanation. One is that the non-experts fail to hear the experts at all. They're in epistemic puddles. Yeah? So it's a very familiar kind of explanation we see in some of the literature. Second kind of explanation is they fail to recognize true experts. They hear the experts, as it were, but maybe because of a polluted epistemic environment, they are unable to figure out who's a true expert and who's a putative expert. That's a bit like Neil Levin's explanation. Then you have people like Tom Sorrell, who just think that the non-experts are stupid, and in some sense think that they fail to show proper epistemic deference to their epistemic matters. Something like that. Now, there's a general worry about this framing. I think the worry is very easy to see. It's that it makes, it depends exactly how you frame it, of course, because people like Levy are very subtle on this, but it does make the vaccine hesitant look stupid, and the rest of us look clever. And that doesn't match any of the research we get from the sociological and anthropological side. Yeah? I think I mentioned this at lunch to someone. Yeah, I think about my own experience, vaccinating my kids. Yeah? I don't have a clue what is in the vaccines. Not a clue. I displayed an incredible lack of ethical or epistemic interest or curiosity. Yeah? I just got a signal, go do this, and I went to do it. By contrast, when you read people who are genuinely vaccine skeptical or genuinely vaccine hesitant, they know an awful lot. They've done a lot of research. In some sense, they've discharged their epistemic duties or discharged their parental duties. There's something very odd about the standard framing. What I want to suggest is one issue the standard framing isn't getting is this potential difference between what I'm going to call epistemic trust and advisory trust. And this obviously follows from everything I've just been telling you. We'll say A has epistemic trust in B, when A takes the fact that B has made some claim P as a weighty reason, perhaps even a preemptive reason, fill in your favourite epistemology of testimony, to believe P herself. Is that trust or mere reliance? I don't care. I really don't care. I've never understood that debate. And then we're also going to say A has advisory trust in B when A takes the fact that B has made some claim P as a reason to treat P as a premise in her practical reasoning. So this is meant to mimic Bennett on epistemic and recommendation trust without this having to be a recommendation. Okay? It's as it were a willingness to move from that's true to that is a claim on the basis of which I will act, where acceptance is viewed as willingness to act. All I want to say is that perceived misalignments undermine advisory trust. Okay? Cases, it's entirely possible, in effect, to bring someone as a true expert but denies she is a good advisor. I'm going to talk through 3 examples which show how this works in practice. Here's one phenomenon. We know it very often in the UK. We see low rates of vaccine uptake in areas with a kind of high Muslim population, high proportion of Muslims in the local population. There is a standard way of understanding what's going on here, where these areas are often described as being of low education or low information, maybe down often to having English as a second language or not having English at all. When you engage in more complicated sociological research, it turns out that very often what's going on in these communities is that the concern is specifically that the vaccine is not halal because it may be containing various kinds of gelatin-derived products. Okay? What's going on in that case? Well, I take it that members of this community suspect some kind of communicative misalignment. The relevant claim for their action is the vaccine halal? The information they're being told is the vaccine is safe. They can simultaneously believe the vaccine is safe, and yet because they do not believe it's halal, this claim does not move into the space of practical reasoning. That's a simple case. Here's a second case. There's some really interesting research by Australian sociologist, political scientist Katie Atwell, looking at vaccine hesitancy among alternative communities in Western Australia. Okay, so you have these communities where very often there's remarkably low rates of vaccination. There is a standard framing of what goes on in these cases, which is that members of these communities are anti-science. Yeah, they hold some kind of anti-scientific view because they hold various kinds of New Age beliefs. Atwell's research is really interesting because very often she talks to the parents, and the parents will give answers along the following lines. They'll say, oh yeah, most kids need a vaccine. My kids don't. And when asked, what's going on there, they say, oh, the scientists are right. For the average child, the vaccine is really important because most children haven't been brought up in the same kind of environment my children have been brought up in. My children have been exclusively breastfed. Because my children are exclusively breastfed, they aren't a danger from the virus. What they effectively are doing is they're engaged in this so-called, I call it, is a form of reference class skepticism. Yeah? They are denying that the reference class which is being used for the claim the vaccine is safe is the relevant reference class for making decisions about their own children. Now, those beliefs might be false, okay? I mean, it may well be that, exclusively breastfeeding your child doesn't provide protection against measles. But note that the underlying reasoning is a concern about misalignment. The reference class being used in the official advice is not a reference class which is decision relevant. Third kind of phenomenon, in the late 90s, lots of concerns in the UK about the MMR vaccine. Often this is framed as a failure to recognise that there was a well-formed scientific consensus, that the vast majority of scientists claimed that the MMR vaccine was safe, only very few people denied the safety of the MMR vaccine. But what's interesting again is when you dig in on this, sometimes you see a version of a reference class skepticism. So go back to Leach's interviewee at the beginning. Exactly what those parents were saying is the population level statistics don't necessarily pick up on kids whose elder sibling has autism. And that's a relevant reference class for my decision. But also, there seems to be, there's really nice work on this by Tammy Boyce, just kind of media studies, that there was a kind of worry there was a misalignment in inductive risk. And this is something you hear a lot, not in academic circles, but you'll hear at school gates. You'll hear the claim which goes, well, of course the scientists, they say it's safe, because they're kind of worried about protecting everyone. But I'm going to vaccinate my own child. And if I'm going to vaccinate my own child, I want a very high level of certainty. I want more than the scientists can provide. So what's going on is this notion that, as it were, the scientists are correct, but relative to the way they're willing to balance the false positive, false negative trade-off, the vaccine is safe. But that way of balancing the false positive, false negative trade-off somehow doesn't meet the standard required for vaccinating one's own child. And note that's compatible with making the scientist's trade-off is entirely reasonable given the population level considerations. Yeah? It's not saying the scientists have got it wrong, it's just saying, I'm not doing it for my child. And so, of course, what you see exactly, like I said, with Leach's interviewee, you often see these forms of misalignment coming together. Yeah? So when you push on the parents, what they'll often say is, they'll say, so, but do you actually, I mean, you see this in Leach's research, Leach will say stuff like that, do you actually believe your kids are at higher risk from the MMR vaccine? Very often we say, well, I don't know if I believe it. What I'm saying is the evidence isn't sufficient to rule it out. There's a complicated form of a reference class concern and an inductive risk concern coming together. At the same time, the parents will say, oh yeah, those parents, when they've got kids and their elder siblings don't have autism, of course they should vaccinate. The vaccine is safe, as it were, just not for their children. So here's what I'm suggesting. This crisis of trust and expertise, which we're often told about, at least in some cases, what we actually see is a high degree of epistemic trust in experts combined with a low degree of advisory trust. Yeah? It's not a denial of expertise, it's a denial that the experts are good advisors. Note that this is complicated. So I'm not denying that some people straightforwardly deny expertise. Yeah? People like Carrie Madej straightforwardly just deny the experts are experts, as it were. What I'm pointing out is there's a second phenomenon. Some people accept the experts are experts, but deny they are what I call good advisors. And of course, it's even more complicated because some of the explanations we give for a crisis of trust in experts would also explain why we're perceived misalignments. Yeah? Go back to the Western Australia case, the alternative communities in Western Australia. Like I said, sometimes I'll say stuff like this. I'll say things like, I exclusively breastfed my kids, therefore my kids are held free to need the vaccine. We understand where this comes from, this reference class, because there's huge health campaigns telling people that exclusive breastfeeding is good. Yeah? And sometimes I say stuff like, I read my kids' chakras, and that means they're going to be fine. Now in that case, it looks like they're moving themselves into a different reference class on the basis of straightforward false belief. Yeah? But what's interesting is the mechanism goes via this roundabout route. Skip this. Okay. So to go back to Bennett's distinction, Bennett distinguishes epistemic trust and recommendation trust. I think it would be far cleaner to distinguish what I call epistemic trust, the kind of trust we have in experts, from advisory trust, the kind of trust we have in advisors. And if we do that, I think we capture lots of what Bennett wants to say, but lots of our talk about a crisis of trust in science is misplaced. But we also kind of grapple better with this notion that science is value-laden. So far this is depressing, but not yet a tragedy. Okay? It's really depressing. Why do I think this is a tragic situation? Here is a tempting thought. There is a crisis of trust in science. Let's assume that's true. That's true, it's not clear. There's a crisis of people not necessarily doing what we want them to do. Vaccinating themselves, vaccinating their children. This is bad. I'm just going to assume this is bad. It's good for people to vaccinate. Good for people to vaccinate their kids. In part, the crisis is due to perceived misalignments, I've just told you. And then here's a solution which you sometimes see in the literature. We should open up science to solve the crisis. We should make science's workings more transparent. If this picture is correct, that's exactly the wrong thing to do. Why? Because it's premised on the idea that there are no real misalignments. And I take it there are real misalignments, and there should be real misalignments. Yeah? Go back to Leach's interviewee one last time. Leach's interviewee is saying that the official science, as it were, doesn't tell us about children like her child. And she's right. In some sense, it doesn't. Why doesn't it? Because it's extremely difficult, epistemically speaking, to do any kind of decent vaccine study on such a small population. What's more, it would be a really stupid use of resources. I think in this case there is a genuine misalignment, and the misalignment is epistemically and politically justified. Yeah? It's the same way that if you need a very expensive treatment on the NHS, and the NHS just refuses to fund it on cost-benefit grounds. There's a misalignment between my interests and what the state is providing, but that misalignment is justified. The same can be true of the scientific research agenda, of inductive risk problems, and so on. More generally, go back to what I said earlier about experts. I think the key feature of what experts are is that experts are people who follow conventions and rules which over time promote the production of important epistemic goods. And this follows very much from his work by Torsten Wilholt. So Wilholt is very concerned that in some sense science is full of these underdetermined, epistemically underdetermined choices. And Torsten's solution to this problem is, he says, well, look, here's what scientists do. They have conventions. Why are conventions important? Because they allow for coordination across the community, and therefore they allow for the production of knowledge. But this looks to me as if exactly what's going on there is that if you have a community which is arranged as a community of experts, a community which is producing knowledge, then that community is going to do two things. First, it's going to limit its attention to tractable questions which can be given definite answers. If you want to arrange yourself as an expert community, a community which is generating knowledge, there are very strong incentives to focus on questions which can be given clear answers. And that's exactly the phenomenon we see in the case of EBM. And similarly, following Torsten, there are very good reasons to have this kind of highly rigid conventions in response to epistemic underdetermination. What that implies then is that experts are typically members of communities governed by conventions, where those conventions are geared towards a broadly epistemic aim. And precisely because those conventions are geared towards a broadly epistemic aim, it doesn't follow that they will necessarily be at all good at responding or aligning to the particular people in front of them. That's not to say that when people are advisors, their behavior is not convention governed. It's just when people are explicitly in the role of an advisor, typically the conventions are conventions which say to align to the person in front of you. So you could say a doctor, an individual doctor, a GP, maybe should align to her patients. We could say that a financial advisor should align their advice to the individual in front of them. But I take it that that's precisely why a GP clinic or a financial advisory centre is not a place where knowledge is accumulated. We don't think that the kind of adding up of all the individual bits of advice and diagnoses in the clinic every day is an accumulation of knowledge. Because in some sense it lacks this kind of community-governed aim of producing generalizable knowledge. So this suggests that advisors are not experts, plus wiggle room for alignment. Instead, something's wrong about Erskine and Catullus' model. Because I take it that typically what's going on here is that what allows us to have basic trust in scientists is precisely that scientists are members of communities, where those communities are governed by very rigid conventions. And when a community is governed by a rigid convention, it's relatively easy to spot a member of a community. But precisely what happens when you have a member of a community which is governed by a very rigid convention is that that person is very unlikely to be worthy of what they call enhanced trust. Yeah? Because following the conventions is not necessarily very likely to align with how you think problems should be solved. So what audiences want are claimer advisors. They want people who can tell them things which they can act on. What audiences get are experts. Experts are nearly everything the audience wants. Because good advice involves making true claims and giving true claims about the world. Good experts are far easier to identify than good advisors because they're embedded in communities where there are rules which allow us to say he is an expert, she is an expert, she is not an expert, and so on. But precisely the features which make experts reliably identifiable, epistemically reliable speakers create misalignments. Yeah? The very fact they're in these communities which generate knowledge in these ways mean that they're very unlikely to be responding to what we care about. And in that sense, it's a tragic situation. Yeah? Think about Juliet's problem. Romeo has all the features she wants in a future husband, apart from one. Yeah? He's in the wrong family. He's a Montague or a Capulet. And similarly, I think experts have nearly all the features that we want in our social epistemic world, but they have one fatal flaw. They're experts, they're not advisors. And so that's why it's the tragedy of public trust in science. Thank you.